Way over here, the first day of the fall semester. We had at least 3 different rooms designated for where we're going to hold this class this semester, so we maybe have at least another third of the students wandering around campus. But anyway, here we are, communication theory. This gives us an opportunity to think about the nature of communication for an entire semester, and in doing that, to see how other people have thought about the process of communication. What is the nature of communication? How does it exist in various kinds of contexts? To what extent does it play a major role in our life? To what extent it plays a minor role in our life? We're interested in all different aspects of what is perhaps one of the most unique experiences of the human animal. Maybe it's what makes us more unique than any other animal in the world, is our ability to communicate. With that ability, we then can do good things, but we can also do some pretty bad things. And if you don't believe me, just watch CNN. They'll give you both sides of that picture. Anyway, I'm Dr. Robert Heath, who is officed in the communication building. The information that I've got here is exactly that's on your syllabus. Those of you that don't have a syllabus, we'll make sure that we get that for you before you leave today. The textbook for this class is this one, Communication Theory. I have a co-author on the book who is perhaps the leading media scholar in the United States. He's an endowed chair at the University of Alabama, used to be a faculty member at the University of Houston. So what I want to do at the beginning of our time today together is to look a bit at what we are going to do during the semester. If you have a copy of the syllabus, and some of you don't yet, maybe all of you do, you will notice that we've broken down, as one would expect, the chapters and the dates, etc., so that you can systematically see what's going on. There are 3 really important dates on there in terms of examinations. We will have 3 examinations, and unless we have monsoons or tidal waves or something, those exams will happen on those particular days. It's really important that we maintain those dates so that you know in advance when it's going to occur. I will allow people to make up exams if they have an excused absence. The state of Texas and the governor, he calls me up periodically, tells me that it is my judgment what constitutes an excuse. I've been at it a long time. I've heard them all. Some of them I actually think are legitimate. The whole point is just trying to run the class in an orderly way. So we'll have 3 exams. We'll talk more about that. We'll give you a review sheet. Those review sheets will also be on what is called WebCT. I have no idea what WebCT is all about. We're going to explore and expand something upon that this semester. My teaching assistant over here is an expert. Those of you that need assistance, she can help you in that regard. One of the other features of this class that we're going to try to bring into the WebCT is a variety of examples. Over the years, as I've taught this class, I've told you things and tried to build upon what would be shared experiences, but this semester I've tried to pick a number of maybe ads would be an example, news stories, interviews, programs. For some of you, I've got a segment on Sesame Street set aside. You can look forward to that. When we talk about language and how people acquire language, what language means, Sesame Street does a great job of explaining one of those theories. I've been watching Cupid, which is a show that apparently none of the college students watch. I haven't found many people that have watched it, but it's interesting to the extent that it allows us to look at a lot of the dimensions of interpersonal communications. We'll probably have an episode of something like Friends on there. All of this is to increase the fact that we can have a sort of shared experience. What are we talking about? What do we see in the way of the phenomena of communication in our life experience, and then how can we better understand it? And that's what communication theory and research is all about. One of the themes that we make in this particular course, is that the development of theory entails four sort of, one can argue, pretty obvious functions. One of those functions is merely observation. When did you first begin to study communication? Some of you say, well, let's see, it was about this time last year, or this is my first semester. The truth is, you began to study communication maybe even before you were born. You began to realize that there are certain patterns to what goes on in the world, and these patterns can become relevant to you. As you got a little older, and that can be a matter of days, weeks, months, or years, you began to realize language was there. You could begin to realize a variety of symbols. You began fairly early on to be a consumer of mass media. Your parents probably sitting, pointing to books. You may have been plunked down in front of Sesame Street as a babysitter. So you began to use Sesame Street. You began to use, now in my grandson's era, it's Blue's Clues. Something going on out there that you engage in communication. So in terms of observation, what we're really looking for is patterns. Communication is patterned behavior, isn't it? Communication is patterned behavior. One of the questions we're going to ask ourselves as we go along, what is communication? One of the ways to think about it is, what is not communication? What is not communication? We often talk about communication as being the transmission of something from one person to another, but let's imagine that this morning as you drove to the university, there were other cars out on the freeway. You might have to sort of stretch your imagination, but you know, there they were, right? And to what extent were all of those other drivers communicating to you something? One of the first things they were communicating to you is they wanted in your lane. They didn't want you in their lane. They wanted you to go faster. They wanted you to go slower. So there's something that we call the flow of traffic, isn't there? There's a way of doing something. Some people even use nonverbal communication as they drive. They signal to their friends and their enemies in various ways, and obviously and unfortunately it can even entail people shooting one another. I heard last night that a woman found her husband and his lover somewhere, and he was run over. It's becoming an epidemic. So I guess that's a statement. Is that a statement? Is that telling people something? If I'm mad at you enough to run over you? Did I send you a message? Was I a message, et cetera, et cetera. So we look at patterns. We look at what is really relevant to our experience as communicators. And as much as anything, that's what I like to believe that I help you to understand. The second thing is we engage in analysis. And as we'll see later on, there are really two kinds of levels of analysis, independent of what may be different between men and women even, and older and younger, et cetera, et cetera. But part of it also is the sort of lay and student approach to this, and then there's a scholarly approach. Scholars spend a lot of time, effort, and money doing research to try to better understand the nature of communication in all of its various contexts. And we're going to talk about those contexts later on. But analysis. I suspect I couldn't ask you to recall at what point you learned that you might communicate with your dad different than your mother. He remembers it. My guess is it probably happened about 1, but he's going to tell me it happened at about age. Now, when you talk in here, you have to press the little speaker in front of you. Let's see how that works. Our first talker in this class, all right?
Right. I remember the difference between my dad talking to me and my mom, because my dad talked in a very physical way. My mom was like a not nice.
But what about you talking to them? If you wanted something, would you go to your mom rather than your dad? Would you go to your dad rather than your mom? Who was the soft one?
Oh, well, relatively neither, but...
Oh, they were neither. Oh, well, you were just a poor, unspoiled child, right? But most people say, well, my mom was always the one that I went to, or my dad's the one that I went to, or I blamed everything on my little brother or my sister, or I did all of these things. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old granddaughter and grandson. He's a very straightforward guy. When he knocks her down, he says, I knocked her down, but I pushed her because. I mean, he'll probably be an engineer. He's very left-brained. She's the younger. She's only 2, but she is manipulative. She's going to whip him into shape sooner or later. He's bigger, but she's smarter. And so you can almost see her thinking of the things that she's going to do and how she's going to say it. You give her another year, and I think the dynamics are going to change rather dramatically between the 2 siblings. Well, the point is that we realize, in one sense, that communication is a big game. One of the themes that I'm going to emphasize is communication is a game. It was a game being played before we got here. It's a game that'll be played after we leave. And I hated to tell you that the first day of the semester, but someday some of us will not be here, and maybe all of us for that matter. The trajectory is that that's the way it all works out. But the game will go on in various ways. The game will go on. It's interesting, some of you may take a course in Shakespeare and wonder how in the world these people ever talk to one another. You can't understand them, and yet in a sense Shakespeare wrote for soap operas. He wrote for a very popular audience. People used to talk that way. Well, the difference is that we don't talk that way today. We look at this kind of thing. We invent language. We change language. We change communication styles because that's the nature of us, the human communicator. The third ingredient as a foundation of theory is we make generalizations. Now, sometimes we make relatively bad generalizations. Sometimes we make pretty good generalizations. Social scientists studying communication are in the generalization business. What we want them to be able to do is to know, to some statistical degree of probability, how things work. But we're interested in that regard, aren't we? I might ask you, and sooner or later in this semester I will, does watching violent television programming make children violent? That's something that we can observe, that's something we can analyze, and we can even generalize about that, can't we? Does watching violent television make children violent? Widely debated. One of the arguments that we discuss when we talk about media and media effects is that media may have dominant effects, meaning that we think almost about nothing other than what the media tell us to think about and how to think about it. Moderate effects, minimal effects. The media have very little effect on us whatsoever. Advertising, how many ads do you see every day that you don't buy the products of? Some of you say, well, I buy everything I see, and that's why my credit rating is as bad as it is, right? Well, might be, but not all of us buy everything that we see. Certainly things by gender might differ. Certainly things by age might differ. What would interest me in my purchasing and so forth might be completely different to you. So the notion is, even then, to what extent do the media influence us? What about the way in which we communicate interpersonally? Do men communicate differently than women do? There was a book called Men Are From Pluto and Women Are From Australia or somewhere. I forget what it was. Venus and Mars got in there somewhere. And it argued that men and women communicate in ways that are often quite different. And you find those sort of gender-based issues popping up. And one of the questions that we might ask is it genetic? Is it socialized? What makes men and women different? We talk about that to some extent in interpersonal communication, because isn't interpersonal communication in one way or another dealing with how people create relationships, how they manage relationships, how they end relationships? One of the pieces that and I don't know how I'm going to get full-length movies onto the web CT. A lot of this I don't know how we're going to accomplish. But some of you may have seen the movie How to Dump a Guy in 10 Days. We have theories about that. One of the theory is that if you want to really, push somebody away, you raise the cost. You raise the cost. You say, I am not worth what I'm costing you. You're supposed to go away. And of course, the guy had an incentive to stay after the girl. And then we know that love wins in the end, which is the way life is. You can laugh at a few of the jokes now and then. You don't have to laugh at all of them. No, we know that life isn't that way, right? That's what Cupid is all about. Last week, the two women working with this woman to find herself a husband, I find it rather interesting. She's also going to find herself $1 million if this all works well. I'm not sure what the incentives are that are at play here. We can watch that and see what goes on. But the part of it was that America got to vote out some of the guys, one of them. And they voted out somebody that these girls liked. And they're saying, well, apparently we're not telling you we like this guy. Now, there are some people up there that we don't like. We want rid of them, so this week, vote them off. One of them is a guy by the name of Robert, and the other guy, I forget all of these things. I get lost in the details. But the notion is that when we watch this, we're looking to see generalizations. Part of the generalization about this show is, how do we know when we encounter other people whether we're going to like them as friends or not? Do we have tests that we use? One of the things that we do, we call that dating. And then during dating, we lie to each other, don't we? We borrow other people's clothes, we take other people's money, we get other people's cars, we do all of these kinds of things and say, here I am. I'm on my very, very best behavior, and the minute we get married, I'm going to go back to my absolute, terrible, despicable ways, so just count on that. Then we have this other sense of the world, and that is that men go into marriage not wanting to be changed. And for us men, women see us as a work in progress. They will spend the rest of their life trying to improve upon us. And we thought just getting a date and going out a couple of times and getting married, that was it. That's as far as this thing went. Well, you see what we're talking about in terms of generalizations. What kinds of generalizations can we make? Predictions. All of this, in one sense or another, leads up to predictions. If I say something a certain way, am I more likely to be successful or unsuccessful than if I say it in a different way? Some of you want to be professional communicators. Some of you want to be in public relations or in advertising or in news or something like that. You don't just act randomly. You act in ways where you think that if I do X under these conditions, then Y outcomes will occur. I want to predict. I want to be able to predict and to know how to play this game of communication, if you would. And so that's essentially what we're looking for. Now, the communication scientists, the people that write the books, that put all of this together, they write the articles, they think about this, they spend a lot of time, but that's not to suggest that we're not communication theorists every day of our life trying to figure things out, trying to know what's going on, trying to see what happens, trying to understand persuasion, either because we don't want people to persuade us or we want to persuade them. It is a knowable phenomenon. It is knowable because we can observe what goes on, we can analyze what goes on, we can generalize, and then based upon that, we can make predictions. So that's sort of what our course is going to deal with. Some other elements that we're going to talk about. And as we get further along, I'll do more to invite you to participate. But I'm just kind of today laying out some foundations, giving you some substance, some blocks at the base of our wall that we can build on. Communication is process. We're going to see this more in subsequent chapters, particularly in Chapter 2. The notion is that communication is, as I said before, this great game that was being played before we got here. We learn how to play it. We play it as best we can. And then when we're gone, that game continues. It's been going on. Process is something that happens. It happens over times. It can be broken into identifiable segments. I talk to so-and-so, you talk to so-and-so, that is a moment, that is a segment. I watch an ad, that is a moment, that is a segment. But there is this notion that it is like the rolling tide of a river. It is just going along, and we're in that for some period of time, and we go along, and we learn it and engage in it because it is, among other things, the basis of our well-being and our survival. Secondly, communication has to do with meaning, the creation of meaning. We're going to talk about the co-creation of meaning, the shared creation of meaning. Why do we like shared meaning? Any ideas? Why do we like shared meaning? Can you imagine if we didn't have shared meaning? if everybody in here had a completely different language and words all meant something quite different? How would we go about getting our Wendy's at lunchtime? We have to know what a biggie size is. We have to know, do you want cheese with that? We have to know a lot of stuff as we go along. Now, what's also interesting is that some meaning is very much a matter of evolution or flux. What are women? Is what a woman was today different than what a woman might have been some much earlier time in the United States? What about women in various countries around the world? Do the rights and privileges and what they can do and how they can go about their daily activities differ for women in America than what might be the case for women in very, very conservative Muslim countries? What you can wear, when you can wear it, what you can do, what you can say. Some of us saw the very horrific pictures of people being executed in Afghanistan, and some of the women had done nothing more than violate what some person believed was a small social faux pas, but that was sufficient to have the woman be executed. We would not think that was appropriate. So what is meaning? What is appropriate? What is woman? What is man? What is this? What is that? In the United States, we spend a lot of time and effort getting cattle, particularly, into a healthy state, get them, build them up, grow them, and all of this, and then we turn them into a McDonald's. Cow is just hamburger on the hoof in the United States. You go to other countries, and cattle are sacred. You go to yet other countries, and what they would eat, you wouldn't. There is something, and I think that in the movie, we'll see if anyone has seen this lately, Quigley Down Under. Ever see that movie? They have what are called widgery grubs. They're about this long, about the size of your finger. They are white with little brown heads. And they apparently are probably pretty good eating. I've never eaten a grub that I know, but people do. Now, the Australians, and I think they have the greatest sense of humor of any people in the world, sell confectionaries that look like widgery grubs. White chocolate with little brown chocolate heads. And I looked at it and I thought, knowing them the way I do, I still won't eat it because I'm afraid that maybe they've got widgery bugs inside of those things, and even if it's chocolate, it may not. You see? But meaning. Now, isn't it just protein? Isn't that what it comes down to? Isn't it just protein? But we differentiate what is edible protein, what is unedible protein, and we're even willing to spend a lot more money for some edible protein than we are for other edible protein. Meaning, the coordination of our activities requires that we have language which we use to share perspectives, to coordinate events, to be able to make things work together. Communication is relationship. How much of all communication has to do with relationships? Well, we say, well, certainly interpersonal communication has to do with relationships. What about organizational communication? Communication that happens within a company. Does that have to do with relationships? Your boss, your superior, your subordinates, your friends, your coworkers, senior management, other customers, vendors, all those people, our relationships count for something, right? What about media? Do they care about your relationships? The more interactive they are, they might. They also are trying to build a relationship with you, and that is that if you watch our program and if you like our products, we will keep our programming coming because the advertisers will pay because the advertisers think that you'll come and buy their products. So even there's an element of relationship. In the last number of years, we've argued that more and more communication has something to do with relationships. One of the reasons I think that we like the Internet as much as we do is that it allows us to have telemediated relationship, interactive communication. But we'll talk more about how all of that evolves as time goes on. Well, as I have previewed some of this today for you, I have talked about contexts. We're interested in contexts. Personal context, to some extent, we're thinking only what is between your ears. What do you think about? What do you know? What do you experience? Interpersonal. You came into the world, you may have thought that you were alone, but you still were probably pretty fond of your mother. All of a sudden, you're rudely awakened. Somebody turns the lights on. A variety of bad things begin to happen, and you realize, whether you know it or not, you're in society. There's all kinds of stuff going on. There are all kinds of people going on. People get to pick you up, take you home, and you are theirs until you are a teenager, and then you don't want to be anybody's. The notion is that interpersonal communication is very much a part of our life. Some people argue, for instance, that most of the difference in how we process mass-mediated communication depends upon the interpersonal contexts relevant to it. First of all, we go and experience media together. Sometimes we call that a date. We call that going out with the guys. Up in the country where I live, there's a bunch of guys that get together every once in a while. We go to movies together. We saw that wonderful movie this summer where people get to drive around in little bitty fast cars in and out of things that are periodically blowing up and all that. It's a real guy movie, those little Mini Coopers. Can't remember the name of it, but it was a great movie. There we were. Popcorn on one side, Coke on the other side, Dolby blasting in our ears. We were all by ourselves together, meaning that each of us was in our own little world experiencing this, but there are our buds on each side, right? Girls get together, women get together, children get together, we all do things, we process the media. We have Super Bowl weekend at our house. We're going to get together for the NBA Finals. Come over to my place. So that we integrate a lot of this. We sit down and we watch our movies together. We bring them home. We do a lot of things that connect interpersonal communication and mass-mediated communication. Also, what's mass-mediated communication about if it's not about relationships? Sitcoms, Friends, is that about relationship? Seinfeld, Cupid, they're all about relationships. Are we fascinated by relationships? Oprah thinks so. Dr. Phil thinks so. Everybody else thinks so. So you see, mass media, relationships, who we are, where we are, how we're navigating this, we're trying to figure it out. Groups. Groups. This is kind of a group, isn't it? It's a part of a larger organization. Some of you work. You have your shift, your group, your coworkers, your area, your department, all of those kinds of things. Some of you belong to clubs. You belong to fraternities or sororities, or you're in a campus activity of some sort. Groups. Groups is just another interesting part of our communication experience, and we study groups. Sometimes groups are very useful. Sometimes groups are seemingly the biggest waste of time in the world. Trying to work with other people can sometimes be very, very complicated, very difficult, very frustrating. We have to take into consideration what they want. And that just messes up our whole life enormously. Organizations. University of Houston is an organization. We communicate, sometimes well and sometimes poorly. Some of you that are still struggling to get over here in time to get the class before the day is over have wandered all over campus saying, where is this thing? Probably asking all kinds of people. Some of them knew. Some of them undoubtedly gave you bad information. I one time was walking across campus. I don't know what it looked like to young people your age. I guess I probably look like a faculty member, but maybe I don't. I don't know. Some guy stopped me and he asked for directions, and I said, well, you go over here, you go over there. And he said, how long have you been on campus? I said, since 1971. He said, do you really know what you're talking about? I said, you know, I don't. I guess I really don't. If you're going to be argumentative about it, check my credentials. You know, I don't know. What am I going to say? Can I, signal to 5 people? Hey, do you know me? Am I a credible source, How do we know these things? It absolutely baffled me. I've never had anybody before say, do you really know where you are? And I guess maybe sometimes you should ask that question of faculty members, but it seemed to me to be a most bizarre question. Societal mediated. Societal mediated. We are a mass-mediated society. We love media. Some of you are glad that we love media. Some of you want to be media superstars. You want to make it all happen. One of the things that's interesting is now we can experience global activities in virtually real time, can't we? All summer long, we watch people on very bad cell, whatever they are, phones that are videotaping something out there, and between dust and sweat and bullets and fuzzy reception. We got reports. Oh, here we're sitting over here in Iraq right now with 101st Airborne, and it's hot. Really an interesting news story. There are 18 people here, and some of us have been shot at today. Really cutting-edge news, right? What in the world do we know about all of that sort of thing? Well, anyway, we love it. It happens. There it is. Partly because of why we want media. And we're going to talk as we go through the semester why we want media, why we want all of this sort of thing to happen. Well, as I talked before, as we create theories and investigate those theories, we do so in a relatively systematic way. What are the ingredients of this systematic inquiry? One is, I said before, the ability to observe. You've got to be good lookers in the sense of being able to look at something and say, that's different from something else, or that's the same as something else. Secondly, you've got to be able to make generalizations. Part of making those generalizations is requiring the ability to recognize patterns. Part of the notion of patterns is it happens over and over and over again. One of the most obvious patterns is when you call somebody on a telephone, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 limited things that they're likely to do? One of them is to say, hello. That's a pattern, right? It doesn't tell us a whole lot, but that's a pattern. If they got called something, they may even know who we are and why we're calling and ignore us, which is communicative, by the way. But the notion of patterns. Curiosity. There ought to be some degree of curiosity. The best scientists, and I would say even often the best communicators, are the ones that are the most curious, the ones that are the most able to imagine, the ones that are the most thoughtfully insightful about what is going on. I wonder what's going to happen. And we are all scientists in that regard. We grew up being relatively curious, and then a lot of times people beat our curiosity out of us. What I'm trying to do this semester is to beat some of that curiosity back into you, if you would. But having my 2 little grandchildren there, I'm just fascinated by the fact that they want to poke everything in the world, they want to prod everything, they want to touch everything, they want to taste everything, and of course sometimes that can be a problem because something can happen to them that you don't want to have happen. But curiosity is an important ingredient in being a communication theorist. It has to be systematic. There has to be a variety of steps and rules and processes that go into that. And we're going to explore more of those as we go further in this particular first chapter. Out of all of that, what we're really trying to do is to distill those few really important factors that make a big difference in the nature of communication. Is control a big factor? Is meaning a big factor? Is information a big factor? Is persuasion a big factor? Is attitude? Is what we're trying to do is to see if these are there, what's going on. Well, then, having gone through all of that, thought, curious, generalize, etc., we stand before our friends and say, I now have a theory. Here's my theory, and they say, well, let's apply the criteria for a good theory. A good theory ought to explain. A good theory ought to explain. We talked about observing. The end product of observing is to explain. Explain what goes on. Secondly, we talked about this. A good theory ought to predict. If I want to be a persuader, how do I go about persuading? What do I say? In what way? At what time? Under what conditions to have a favorable change of attitude or to motivate somebody to do something? A good theory ought to be useful. We like the word heuristic. A good theory ought to be useful. It ought to help us to do some things that we would like to have done. Well, what might those do? As a person interested in television programming, we might want to know what makes something entertaining. And if we knew what makes something entertaining, we can use that to predict then that what we do will attract an audience, and by that we can sell advertising space, time, and we can be a successful mass-mediated entity. Theory is useful. Relationship building, theory is useful. Dealing with other people, theory is useful. Being a supervisor, theory is useful. And arguably, a good theory is useful. Sometimes people respond to what we talk about in this class saying, first of all, isn't it common sense? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But secondly, some people say, how can I use that? Or, I like what we talk about because I see that I can use it. There are people that believe that if it's a theory that it ought not to be useful, or that if it is a theory that it need not be useful. And I think most people would say that's not particularly the case, that we like to believe that theory building, that understanding some phenomena is in and of itself in various ways useful. The next element here is that a good theory ought to be parsimonious. Parsimonious! Now there you go. See, you can go home now and tell your parents, those of you that are getting some tuition help from them, guess what? I learned that a good theory ought to be parsimonious. You see, they'll just feed off that. They'll think that you've got so much knowledge today, they will immediately grab the checkbook and write you a big check to pay for your tuition. Parsimonious. Theoretically, objectively, you ought to be able to write a theory on the back of an envelope. In a sense, what is the essence of a theory? What is the essence of a theory? We're going to talk about a theory called involvement theory. Involvement theory suggests that we are more attentive to messages related to the attitudes that we want to formulate relevant to the outcomes that we see rewarding or unrewarding. Involvement theory means that we sort through a lot of stuff in the world based upon whether we think it's going to be useful for us or not. Now, we've got books, we've got articles, we've got chapters written on involvement theory, but I've captured it in one line. The dominant media theory model we call the magic bullet model. Means that people fire bullets of knowledge into your head, and there it is, bang, just like that. We have people that try to teach by driving information into people's heads. I think there's a law against that. It's called child abuse. Driving stuff into people's heads. We don't do that. It doesn't work that way, right? What is parsimonious? Cultivation theory. Repeated exposure to messages are likely to give us a view of the world that those messages contain. Meaning that if we watch a lot of violent television, we may begin to believe that the world is violent. Can you watch nonviolent television? Is there such a stuff out there now? I also think it's interesting, isn't it? This is one of my side editorials. Ever heard of a company called Walt Disney? G-rated, right? Start off the movie with sharks eating people's parents, little girls being intimidated by older women and two ugly sisters, stepsisters, cats being chased by mice, hunters cutting hearts out of children. Isn't that children's fare? No wonder we all grew up so weird. We believed that Walt Disney was nonviolent. It's G-rated. Well, anyway, if we expose ourselves to a lot of media of one kind, it may reinforce or it may create the sense that the world is as we see it. A theory ought to be internally consistent, meaning that it ought not to argue against itself. A good theory ought to be capable of being falsified. Good theory ought to be capable of being falsified, meaning that we can disprove it. If we can't think of ways to disprove it, then by the definition of theory building, we cannot think of ways to prove it. Because to prove it means we've got to be able to build a case for it, but that means that we've got to think of what would be the argument against that being a reasonable explanation. And finally, and this is largely the influence of maybe the last 20 years, the influence of the critical cultural theorists. Their argument now is that we should continue to work for increasing ethical ways of understanding, teaching, and communicating. Increasing ethical challenges. Increasing ethical challenges. Issues of political correctness, for instance, are very important to these people. Issues of violence become important. They're wanting to understand the ways in which communication as it is used in a society, makes us better humans or dehumanizes us. That's an important challenge from the point of view of these individuals. Now, some of you might say, and it's a reasonable question to ask, what relevance do these criteria have for me in the long-term success of this semester? Two answers to that. One is, the kinds of examples that we give in the review sheet can help you to understand this, but these sorts of terms are the ones that I like to pick out to put on for ID questions in the examination. For instance, I might have the word predicts as in theory. What would you write after that as a short definition of the word predicts as a criteria for a sound theory? So that's the sort of thinking that you might want to engage in as you prepare for the exam, as you read, as you think about what we're talking about here. Secondly, when you get the syllabus, if you don't already have the syllabus, you'll notice in there that the syllabus suggests that you should take a theory, pick a theory, your theory, not your theory in terms of you had to dream it up, but one that you liked, write about that theory, apply it to your everyday circumstances, and then evaluate that theory. Now, how would you evaluate that theory? Well, tell me whether you think that theory explains, predicts, assists, it's useful, it's parsimonious, etc., all the way down the line. So the questions then that we're looking at is, how do we do all of this theory building, theory analysis, and theory application in some sort of systematic way, which is really the essence of the social scientific method. And that's what we're really talking about as a class in communication theory. It has a lot to do with the nature of social science. It also has a fair amount to do with the nature of humanities studies, communication as a humanities experience, as people experiencing their lives together. Maybe this would be a good point to stop and see if you have questions. I've tried to spend a fair amount of time laying out some foundation for what we're talking about, where we're going. We have to work out a little bit of the ground rules in here. Anyone that wants to ask a question or makes a comment needs to press the buttons on the speaker in front of them. As we get further down the line, I'm going to try and get more interactivity, but let's begin with some of that today. Yes, sir?
Do you think there's going to be room to add?
I have no idea. We're going to figure that out. As I look around here, I would say that we don't have enough room. What do you think? What I'm going to do is to cut it off at 40. We had 25 get legitimately enrolled. We have some special cases in here, and the rest of the people we're going to deal with in a sort of lottery fashion. One of the theories of communication that we work on is called uncertainty reduction. And so we're all engaging in some amount of uncertainty reduction, aren't we? To see to what extent life deals us well or deals us badly. But then maybe that's the whole nature of the enrollment process. Other questions as we sort of begin to get oriented to ourselves in this class. And more people show up. Wandering around campus, getting a campus tour. Yes, sir?
Are there going to be more changes in the classroom, or are we for sure in here?
We're going to be here for sure, unless we change. No, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. Life is subject to the potentiality of change. But my understanding is this is where we will be. Part of the whole notion of being a well-educated individual is being able to engage in the process of discovery. And so we first of all challenge you to discover where we are, right? So here we are. What else? What else can we talk about? What other questions do you have? We may. We're working on that, yes.
You said that you were talking about, for the paper, we have to pick a theory.
You bet.
Did you, like, understand, you know, what constitutes
I love people who say I understand. Go for it.
But did you actually give, like, a list of theories?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay.
That's what we're going to do more and more and more and more and more of. I've had students at the end of the semester say, why didn't you call us just when you had down to one theory? Unfortunately, we've got a lot of them. We have different theories for language. We have different theories for persuasion, some of which contradict one another, some of which add on to one another. Different theories of interpersonal attraction, all kinds of things. So one of the sort of objectives, and that's why I talk about it in the beginning with all of these possibilities, is to sort of encourage people to go scurrying along in the text, looking for that theory that they sort of like, or listening as they get into the lecture, saying, that sounds pretty interesting to me, maybe that's what I would like to do my paper on. Because I like to encourage people to get started on those early, but today would be too early. But sometime in the next several days, you might begin to discover, oh, that sounds pretty interesting, maybe that's what I'll do my theory on. And then sometimes people say, oh, that's interesting, that's what I'll do my theory on. Then here comes another one, oh, that's the one I want to do my theory on. And then it's like being in a good department store. You can't decide what of all the choices you want to make as your choice. And I'll also be happy to discuss with you your paper as it begins to develop. I will even take a very, 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 very brief outline. I will be delighted to chat with you as we go across campus, but I will not read your first rough draft, because that would mean that I would also have to read your second rough draft and your third rough draft and your fourth rough draft and your fifth rough draft and your sixth rough draft and your seventh rough. There's no end to that train, right? But I will be happy to talk with you and see that you're on the right track. As I say, we try not to have any surprises in here. We'll have reviews built in. I'll keep my office hours. We may decide, because I think that with the cameras and the speakers, we may reduce the likelihood that people want to ask questions and make comments in here, for fear that their question or comment will be there for every generation of student ever to see and say, what kind of a stupid person would ask that stupid question? Well, I'd never think of a question as being stupid, but you know, some people might. And so we may want to have more of a review session outside of here, because it may give you more of a feeling that you do want to ask questions and make comments and so forth. But be happy to engage in dialogue in here as well. And sometimes I'm even going to really push hard to get a dialogue going, because that's the way I like to teach. I don't like to teach just standing in front of people talking. You might think that I'd like to do a lot of that, because I've done that pretty much today, but part of it is I just need to get into stuff far enough to begin to give us a foundation that we can begin to think and imagine and react and muddle through this in more of an open dialogue kind of fashion. So, any other questions that you might have along that line? I do encourage you to ask questions. I know that at various times you will be somewhat restrained by having to use the microphones in front of you and worrying about that. I don't mind you disagreeing with me. You would be amazed at the number of times students have argued with me over the years. I don't think that I'm intolerant to argument. I think that part of that is the whole nature of this. So I think that we ought to have a good time together. I think that we ought to see the study of communication theory as something that can be relatively enjoyable. One of the benefits of being a teacher that's done this kind of thing for a long time is I run onto students who have been in my classes who tell me that stuff that I talked about was actually interesting and stayed with them. And it makes me feel good, because if I'm teaching material that isn't relevant, that isn't thought-provoking, then that bothers me in one way or another, because I think that's what an education ought to do. It ought not to be just the imparting of fact. And some of what we do in here is just going to be the imparting of fact. This is what the word predicts means. This is one of the criteria of a theory to predict. All of that has to be there. It's part of the language of the way in which we go about the business of building knowledge. But when we get more of that in us and more foundation, then we ought to be free to scrutinize these theories and ask questions about these theories and challenge one another. And on various of these topics, I really do try to get people more and more and more engaged. I'm a paper and chalk guy. I haven't been able to write anything on the board today. I've got some little brown pieces of paper I'm supposed to be able to write on. My handwriting is so bad that I'd hate to have that for posterity. But there are times when I like to ask people, for instance, in here, well, what do you think makes a good relationship? Some people will say, love, trust, control, shared control, no control. I don't know, but my boyfriend doesn't know. You know, and that's what we ought to be talking about at various times, right? Because we're talking about people, humans. One of the people that I write about early in the chapter 1, is a guy by the name of Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke will pop up over and over again. He's one of the people that wrote one of the theories of language. And Kenneth Burke says that what really is unique about the human animal is our symbol misusing ability. I mentioned earlier that we're not the only animal that communicates. Certainly not by the definition of communication as we will probably talk about it in here. One of the arguments I will make, for instance, and you can begin to think about this, that communication is influence. Communication is influence. That anytime I influence you, I have communicated. Is that too general? Is that too big? I know that some of you like to say, well, let's say sender getting a message that they encode, and then they put it into a channel, and they decode it, and then the receiver, and then we get feedback. Okay. So we know Schramm's model, or we know some of the other models that we'll talk about in the next chapter, and we're coming to models. But what does that not account for? What does that not account for? Can silence be communicative? It is on my part, and my wife's part. What are you thinking? That's an awful lot of stuff you're thinking about. How mad are you at me? When will you ever quit being mad? See? Silence can sometimes be very, very powerful. So, all of that sort of thing. Does communication have to be predicted and planned? Well, let's imagine that a man and his lover are coming out of a motel. And the woman with her Suburban is there, and she runs into the woman's car and over the husband. Now, she's communicated. He didn't plan to say that he was engaged in an adulterous affair, I'm sure, to her, but that's what he said when he walked out with this woman, and there it was. Well, that's the news out of Austin. But we've had similar news locally, right? You tell somebody, I love you forever, by ever, 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 and then the next day that person sees you, oh my gosh, right? You've communicated. Did you want to communicate? And then sometimes we try to communicate and we can't. And sometimes we don't want to communicate and we do. And again, it gets to be a mess at times, doesn't it? Kind of gets to be a mess at times. But we're stuck with it. Burke says that with this process of communication, we can build wonderful societies. We can have art. We can have drama. We can have love. We can have friendship. We can have companionship. We can solve the mysteries of the universe. We can cure diseases. We can correct medical malfunctioning in adults and children and so forth. We can do a lot of stuff. Because one of the things that communication allows us to do is to store and share knowledge with subsequent generations. We can put stuff together. You know, if we want to find out what ants know, we have to go out and ask each individual ant. We can't go to an ant library. We can't go to their video collection and see what they like to watch. We can't read their poetry, which they wrote down. But humans, we do that. By the same token, Burke said we are the symbol misusing animal. How many of the problems that we have in the world are the result of people communicating in ways that other of us think they ought not to communicate? We can communicate hatred, can't we? We can communicate selfishness and narrowness and meanness. We can do awful things to one another. I grew up with a mystery in my mind, and it was that as a kid, somebody said, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Oprah doesn't think so. I mean, isn't Oprah all about words that can hurt as well as looks and all the other things that we do, which are communicative? So when I think about communication, a lot of times what I'm focusing upon is what is communicative? How do we become known to one another? How do we become known to one another? We use words, we use gestures, we touch, we don't touch, we use silence, we do a lot of things. How do we coordinate ourselves so that we're at the same place at the same time, eventually, even in this class, with 3 different classrooms originally announced where people might be? We can use language to coordinate ourselves. We use communication to coordinate ourselves. How many millions of people move around in the world on a given day simply because we can coordinate a great deal of human activity through the power of communication? Football team, coordinate, communicate. Communicate, coordinate. Production group, the Daily Cougar, we work together through communication to be communicators. Our whole life experience. I could ask you to think of not being able to communicate and not to do anything to communicate for a whole semester and see what you might do. Faculty member at the University of Oregon a few years ago did that, and one guy put a plastic bag over himself and went around campus all semester thinking he was not communicating with anyone. He became a national celebrity. They had video cameras out there. Was he not communicating? Can you think of not being able to communicate? Can you think of not being able to communicate well or properly? We also sometimes think about being able to uncommunicate. Did you ever try to uncommunicate? Sometimes we call that an apology. Sometimes we call it a rationalization, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Aren't you still communicating?
You bet.
I was about to say, I don't think
You
can
bet.
communicate, right?
You bet. We can't uncommunicate. You can't go back. Take that back. Forget that I ever said that. Can you even do that when you're on a jury? And, of course, the prosecuting attorneys and so on want you never to forget it. That's why they get somebody to say, tell them to forget that. That's the one thing that they'll remember as they sat there all morning long, right? So here we are, the communicating animal. Well, one of the ways in which we begin to explain to other people how communication works together is that we indeed engage with models. Models, and I don't know, did that not come up there? Am I the only thing up there? I've got one more screen that I wanted to mention because it kind of predicts where we're going next. But models, if you look in chapter 2 on, for instance, page 64, and any number of you have been in a communication class where you've seen communication models before, but in there is a model of communication on page 64. It sounds very similar to some of you. Information source, transmitter, receiver, destination, noise source, something that interferes with the message getting through, all of that sort of thing. On other pages in that chapter, page 66 we have models, page 67 we have models. Well, what are these models all about? What are we trying to do? Last part of the lecture today. We're going to see that we have three kinds of models. The most primitive model is merely a list. If I were to ask you to work with me to come up with a list of the terms that are relevant to describing the quality of a relationship, you would be engaging in a taxonomy, putting together a list of words. We think these words are relevant, but we don't know how they work together, these concepts, these variables. The second type of model that we have is what we can call a pictorial or a graphic model, which is what I just showed you. Boxes and arrows and squiggles and swirls and all of that kind of thing. And then the last kind of model is a mathematical model. We don't have many of them. There are a couple of them in the book. And those of you that are mathematically challenged, I mention this in advance so that when you get to that part, you can put on your mathematic protector gear so that you don't have to think that it really is math. But on page 363, for instance, is a mathematical formula that is used to explain media effects. So one can argue that we're sort of making a progression in that regard. What are the key variables? Can we put them together in some sort of systematic way to show how they influence one another? What comes first? What comes second? Do things work together in some way? And then arguably, if we're moving further and properly, we will come to the point that we can even capture that in a mathematical formula. Somebody had a question in back. Yeah. Ah, okay. You are mathematically challenged. Well, you're not alone. These are communication majors. And so, there we are. I hope you will not be theoretically challenged. Maybe you will be challenged by me. Maybe you will be not. But I hope that you find as much interest and curiosity in digging through the theories to better try to understand what it is that we are dealing with. As I'm looking at the clock up there, I see that it's about 15 minutes to go. I don't know. I have to stop and think whether that, and I'll probably let you out early today anyway, but I have to stop and think whether that clock is set that when it counts down, I am at 0, and I know that they told me the other day that I even have to watch the lights come on back there, but I think I'm actually letting you out just a little bit early. That'll give you a chance to go and find the other classes that are not in the room, that are listed properly. Some of you want in the class. We'll be happy to negotiate that with you in the next few minutes, all right? So I'll see you on Thursday, some of you.
Yo vine a mi huerto, oh hermana, esposa mía. He recogido mi mirra y mis aromas. He comido mi panal y mi miel. He bebido mi vino y mi leche.
Yo dormía, pero mi corazón velaba. Es la voz de mi amado que llama.
Ábreme, hermana mía, amiga mía, paloma mía, perfecta mía. Porque mi cabeza está llena de rocío, mis cabellos empapados de las gotas de la noche.
Me he desnudado de mi ropa. ¿Cómo me he de vestir? He lavado mis pies. ¿Cómo los he de ensuciar? Mi amado metió su mano por el agujero de la puerta y mi corazón se conmovió dentro de mí. Yo me levanté para abrir a mi amado y mis manos gotearon mirra, mis dedos mirra que corría sobre la manecilla del cerrojo. Abrí